December 10th was when everything finally came together, though not in a way I ever expected. I was working late in my home office, going through some financial reports when I heard Sarah's phone buzz in the kitchen. She was upstairs showering, so I glanced over and saw a text preview that made my stomach drop. It was from Marcus, and it said something about meeting tomorrow like they discussed. I sat there staring at that phone for probably 10 minutes, my mind racing through all the possibilities. Maybe it was innocent, maybe they were planning something for my birthday next month. But deep down I knew something was wrong. The secrecy, the timing, the way they'd both been acting lately, it all started clicking into place. When Marcus showed up an hour later for what he said was a spontaneous visit, I decided to confront him directly. I told him I'd seen the text and asked what kind of meetings he and Sarah had been having behind my back. At first he tried to laugh it off, saying they were just coordinating some surprise for me. But I pressed him and his story kept changing. I told him I wasn't buying it and that I needed the truth. Marcus got defensive, asking why I was being so paranoid and suspicious of my own friends. He said I was letting stress from work make me imagine problems that didn't exist. But I could see something in his expression that I'd never noticed before. A kind of guilt mixed with something that looked almost like satisfaction. So I decided to try a different approach. I told him I was going to ask Sarah directly about their meetings and see what she said. That's when Marcus finally started to crack. He asked me to sit down and said there were some things he needed to explain. I could tell he was struggling with whether to come clean or keep lying. I started recording on my phone without him knowing, just in case. Marcus began talking about how he'd always felt like he was living in my shadow, watching me succeed while he struggled. He said it started in college when I got the internship he wanted, then continued when I met Sarah first, and got worse when my business took off while his career stagnated. Then he broke down completely. Marcus admitted he'd been having an affair with Sarah for the past 2 years. He said it started as revenge against me, a way to take something that was mine, but then it became more complicated. He told me he loved her and thought she might leave me for him eventually. I just sat there listening, trying to process what I was hearing. This man I'd trusted with everything, my business secrets, my personal problems, my family, had been systematically betraying me for years. The recording kept running as he continued talking, admitting to things I hadn't even suspected yet. Marcus said the affair wasn't the only way he'd been getting back at me. He confessed to sabotaging my business whenever he could, sharing confidential information with competitors, and even badmouthing me to potential clients when opportunities arose. He said he justified it by telling himself I had too much and needed to be brought down a few notches. By the time he finished talking, I had over 20 minutes of recorded confession on my phone. Marcus looked exhausted, like he'd been carrying this weight for years, and was almost relieved to finally let it out. He asked if I could forgive him, said he wanted to make things right somehow. I told him he needed to leave and that we'd figure out what came next later. It was past midnight when I finally went upstairs to confront Sarah. She was already in bed, pretending to be asleep, but I could tell she was awake by her breathing. I sat on the edge of the bed and told her I needed to talk to her about Marcus. She immediately got defensive, asking why I was bringing him up so late at night. I played her a portion of the recording where Marcus admitted to the affair. Sarah's face went completely white, and she started crying before the audio even finished. She tried to minimize it at first, saying it was just a mistake that happened a few times and didn't mean anything. I told her I had the full confession and knew it had been going on for 2 years. Sarah broke down and admitted the affair had been more serious than she initially claimed. She said Marcus had been very persistent, always complimenting her and making her feel appreciated in ways she felt I wasn't. According to her, he'd gradually convinced her that I was taking her for granted and that she deserved better treatment. I asked her how she could betray me with my best friend, someone who was supposed to care about our family. Sarah said Marcus had made it seem like he was looking out for her interests, pointing out times when I was too focused on work or not paying enough attention to her needs. She claimed he'd manipulated her emotions and made her feel like the affair was justified. The conversation went on for hours. Sarah kept trying to shift blame to Marcus, saying he pursued her relentlessly and made her feel guilty for not responding to his advances. She admitted they'd been meeting regularly, sometimes at hotels but often at his apartment when I was traveling for business. She said she'd wanted to end it several times but Marcus had convinced her to continue. I asked if she knew about Marcus sabotaging my business, and Sarah looked genuinely surprised. She said she had no idea about that part and thought his problems with me were just personal jealousy. When I played more of the recording where Marcus admitted to the business sabotage, Sarah seemed shocked. She said she never would have gotten involved with him if she'd known he was actively trying to destroy our livelihood. Sarah begged me not to make any hasty decisions, saying we could work through this with counseling and that she'd cut off all contact with Marcus immediately. She promised the affair was over and that she realized how wrong she'd been. But I told her the trust was completely broken and that I needed time to figure out what came next. I ended up sleeping in the guest room that night, my mind racing through years of memories and trying to figure out what had been real and what had been manipulation. Every conversation with Marcus, every business setback, every argument with Sarah. I was seeing it all in a completely different light now. The hardest part was realizing how long this had been going on right under my nose. 2 years of lies, betrayal, and sabotage while I trusted both of them completely. I kept thinking about all the times Marcus had comforted me about business problems he'd actually caused, or listened to me worry about my marriage while he was actively destroying it. The next morning, I went straight to my office to dig deeper into Marcus's business sabotage claims. I'd been suspicious about certain patterns for years but never had a reason to investigate thoroughly. Now I had a specific target and timeline to work with. I pulled out files from every major deal that had fallen through unexpectedly, every competitor bid that had mysteriously undercut ours, and every client relationship that had soured without clear cause. I started with the Hartwell Industries contract from 3 years ago. We'd spent months developing a comprehensive strategy for their digital transformation, and our proposal was exactly what they needed. Then suddenly, a smaller competitor swooped in with a nearly identical approach at half our price. At the time, I figured it was just bad luck and aggressive pricing, but now I wondered if Marcus had leaked our entire proposal. Going through my email archives, I found dozens of conversations where I'd shared confidential client information with Marcus. He'd always been interested in my work, asking thoughtful questions about strategy and implementation. I thought he was being supportive and genuinely curious about the business. Now I realized he'd been systematically gathering intelligence to use against me. The pattern became clearer as I dug deeper. Almost every major setback in the past decade coincided with periods when Marcus had been particularly involved in my business discussions. The Morrison Group deal that collapsed after they suddenly decided to go with a competitor who knew our exact pricing structure. The Peterson account that dropped us after someone leaked information about their internal politics that only Marcus and I had discussed. I found evidence in my calendar that Marcus had often scheduled drinks or dinner meetings right after I'd landed new clients or developed innovative strategies. He'd pump me for details about my approaches, client weaknesses, and competitive advantages. I'd shared everything openly because I trusted him and valued his input. He'd been building a database of information to sell to my competitors for years. The most damning evidence came from cross-referencing my business losses with Marcus's financial records, which I could access through some mutual investments we'd made. Every time one of my deals fell through to a specific competitor, Marcus had made unexplained deposits into his accounts within weeks. The amounts were consistent with what someone might pay for high-quality competitive intelligence. I spent the entire morning documenting everything, building a comprehensive timeline of sabotage that went back almost a decade. The scope was staggering. Marcus hadn't just been having an affair with my wife, he'd been systematically destroying my professional reputation and financial stability for years. Every piece of advice he'd given me, every shoulder he'd offered when deals went bad, every word of encouragement had been manipulation designed to keep me trusting him while he worked against me. By noon, I had a folder full of evidence showing a clear pattern of corporate espionage and sabotage. Bank records, email timestamps, client testimonials mentioning competitor knowledge they shouldn't have had, and financial correlations that proved Marcus had been profiting from my failures. Combined with his recorded confession from the night before, I had everything I needed to take legal action. The betrayal felt even worse now that I understood the full scope. This wasn't just about jealousy or a moment of weakness. It was a calculated long-term campaign to destroy everything I'd worked for. Marcus had been playing a completely different game, while I thought we were friends supporting each other through life's challenges. 1 week later, I was sitting across from Sarah and her lawyer in a mediation office, armed with evidence that would change everything about our divorce proceedings. Sarah had initially tried to frame the divorce as a mutual decision where we'd split assets fairly, including her getting half of my business. Her lawyer had prepared arguments about her contributions to my success and her rights as a spouse to marital property. I let them present their case first. Sarah talked about how she'd supported my career, managed our household, and deserved compensation for the years she'd invested in our marriage. Her lawyer emphasized that the business had grown during their marriage, and that Sarah was entitled to half its value regardless of the affair. They seemed confident that the adultery wouldn't significantly impact the financial settlement. Then I presented my evidence. I started with the recorded confession from Marcus, playing the parts where he admitted to the 2-year affair and described how he'd systematically sabotaged my business. Sarah's face went pale as she heard Marcus's voice detailing their relationship and his deliberate efforts to destroy my career. Her lawyer looked increasingly uncomfortable as the recording continued. Next, I showed them the comprehensive documentation I'd compiled of business sabotage over the past decade. Bank records showing Marcus's unexplained deposits after my deals fell through, email evidence of confidential information I'd shared with him, and financial analysis proving the correlation between his payments and my losses. The pattern was undeniable and showed damages in the millions of dollars. The game changer came when I presented evidence that Sarah had been involved in some of the sabotage, whether she realized it or not. Phone records showed she'd been feeding Marcus information about my travel schedule, upcoming meetings, and business concerns I'd shared with her privately. Text messages revealed her complaining to Marcus about my work habits and sharing details about client relationships that he'd later used against me. Sarah's lawyer asked for a recess to discuss the new evidence privately. When they returned, Sarah was crying and her legal strategy had completely changed. She claimed she hadn't known Marcus was using the information to hurt my business, and that she'd only been venting to someone she thought was a friend. But the evidence showed a pattern of information sharing that had directly contributed to my professional losses. I presented my settlement offer. Sarah would get minimal spousal support, no claim to the business, and would sign a non-disclosure agreement about the affair and sabotage. In exchange, I wouldn't pursue criminal charges against her for her role in the corporate espionage, or seek to recover damages from her personally. I'd already filed separate lawsuits against Marcus for fraud, corporate espionage, and intentional interference with business relationships. Sarah's lawyer tried to negotiate, arguing that she'd been manipulated by Marcus and shouldn't lose everything because of his schemes. But the evidence was too strong and they knew it. The recorded confession alone would destroy any sympathy she might get from a judge, and the business sabotage evidence showed this wasn't just a personal betrayal, but a criminal conspiracy that had cost me years of income and reputation. After hours of negotiation, Sarah agreed to my terms. She'd get enough money to start over but nothing close to what she'd originally demanded. The business would remain entirely mine, along with most of our other assets. She'd also have to testify against Marcus in the criminal and civil cases I was pursuing against him. Walking out of that mediation office, I felt like I'd finally taken control of the situation. For years, Marcus and Sarah had been working against me while I trusted them completely. Now they'd both face real consequences for their betrayal, and I'd have the resources to rebuild what they'd tried to destroy. 2 weeks later, I decided it was time to expose Marcus to our entire social circle. He'd been telling people his version of events, painting himself as someone who'd made mistakes but was trying to make amends. He claimed the business issues were coincidental, and that the affair was a moment of weakness that got out of hand. Some of our mutual friends were actually sympathetic to him, thinking I was being too harsh about a personal matter. I organized a gathering at the community center where our friend group regularly met for events. I told everyone I wanted to address the rumors about Marcus and me, and that there were things they needed to know before choosing sides. About 20 people showed up, including some of Marcus's closest supporters who thought I was being vindictive. Marcus arrived looking confident, probably thinking he could charm his way through whatever I planned to say. He'd always been good at manipulating social situations and making himself look like the reasonable one. He sat in the front row with a few friends who'd been defending him, ready to counter whatever accusations I made. I started by thanking everyone for coming and acknowledging that the situation was uncomfortable for all of us. I said I understood that people were hearing different versions of what happened, and that I wanted to provide some clarity. Then I played the recorded confession from that night in my office, letting Marcus's own words tell the story. The room went completely silent as Marcus's voice filled the space, admitting to years of jealousy, the systematic sabotage of my business, and the calculated seduction of my wife. You could hear people shifting uncomfortably in their seats, as he described feeding information to my competitors and deliberately undermining deals I'd worked months to secure. The affair admission was bad enough, but the business sabotage shocked everyone. Marcus tried to interrupt, claiming the recording was taken out of context and that he'd been coerced into saying things that weren't true. But I had more evidence to present. I showed them the comprehensive documentation of financial correlations between my business losses and Marcus's unexplained income. Bank records, email timestamps, and client testimonials that proved he'd been profiting from sabotaging me for nearly a decade. Several people in the room looked disgusted as they realized the scope of Marcus's betrayal. These were people who'd watched me struggle through business setbacks while Marcus comforted me and offered advice. Now they understood that he'd been causing the problems he was helping me cope with. The manipulation was so calculated and cruel that even his supporters started to look uncomfortable. Marcus's defense crumbled as I presented more evidence. Phone records showing his communications with competitors, financial analysis proving the correlation between his payments and my losses, and testimony from clients who'd been approached by people with inside knowledge of my strategies. The pattern was undeniable and showed a level of premeditation that made his betrayal even worse. By the end of the presentation, Marcus was sitting alone. Friends who defended him were apologizing to me and expressing shock at what they'd learned. People who'd known him for years said they felt sick thinking about how he'd manipulated all of us. The community that had been divided about our conflict was now united in their disgust at Marcus's behavior. Marcus left without saying anything, but I could see the defeat in his posture. His reputation was destroyed, his friendships were over, and everyone now knew the truth about who he really was. The recording and evidence had done what I'd hoped. They'd shown our friends that this wasn't just a personal dispute, but a pattern of calculated cruelty that had gone on for years. Epilogue *. 6 months later, I'm rebuilding everything Marcus tried to destroy, and it's going better than I expected. The divorce is finalized, the criminal charges against Marcus are moving forward, and I've recovered significant damages through civil litigation. More importantly, my business is thriving now that I'm not being sabotaged from within. Clients who've been suspicious about my company's security are returning, and new opportunities are opening up that had been blocked before. Sarah moved across the country and we communicate only about logistics involving our kids. She's in therapy and claims to understand how badly she was manipulated. But the trust is gone forever. Our children are adjusting to the new reality, and I'm focused on being the best father I can be while protecting them from the worst details of what happened. Marcus lost everything. His job, his reputation, most of his friends, and he's facing serious legal consequences. The evidence of corporate espionage was so comprehensive that prosecutors are pursuing felony charges. He tried to reach out a few weeks ago, wanting to apologize and explain himself, but I'm done listening to his manipulation. The recorded confession and years of evidence speak for themselves. The hardest part has been learning to trust my instincts again. For years, I ignored red flags and dismissed suspicions because I trusted people who were actively working against me. Now I'm more careful about who I confide in and what information I share. It's made me more guarded, but also more aware of the people who genuinely support me versus those who might have hidden agendas. Looking back, I realized that Marcus's jealousy and Sarah's betrayal revealed something important about my life. I had built something worth destroying. Despite all their efforts to sabotage me, my business survived and my relationships with my children remained strong. The people who really matter stood by me when the truth came out, and I'm grateful for that clarity about who my real friends are.